We're going to discuss, obviously, in first place, the protests across U.S. campuses against Israel's war on Gaza, in sympathy with the Palestinians, against Israel's ongoing occupation, and so on. Now, the big reason, obviously, that this has become a major flashpoint is the repression faced by protesters. And there's also a wider authoritarian context that has emerged on this issue specifically. Regular listeners will know, of course, that we support and defend free speech in any and all cases. And so we're very disturbed by the crackdowns on protest and on the wider restrictions on speech and dissent. That's in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. But we also think that that's probably the easy part, at least making that declaration and standing by that principle, as important as it is at least intellectually, kind of the easier part. What we want to do here is we want to put the protests and clampdowns in a wider context. So we take it as read that student protests in general are limited at best. We don't want to rehearse all the critiques that we might have of student protests. I think they should come out probably, at least tacitly, as we go through this, because there's a lot more to be examined here, whether we're sympathetic with what the protesters want or not. We want to look at the wider politics. So that's the war on Gaza itself, the regional Middle Eastern scenario, obviously, but also the context of the Western left itself after the end of millennial socialism or left populism. And also at the end, I think we also want to touch on something which is important. It's a really big question, which we're not going to be able to deal with in full, but about whether we're entering a new era of war and how Israel and Palestine may or may not fit into that whole story.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to BungaCast. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, and we're also George Hoare. Well, we collectively are George Hoare in London. Hi, George.
I don't know how to answer that. We are, and we are also Alex, and we are Philip Cunliffe. I can introduce him because we are him.
Hello, how are we?
We are well. So we're recording this on Friday the 3rd of May. This is important in case things happen since we recorded this and in the interval between you hearing it. So we're here to discuss, in first place, the protests across U.S. campuses against Israel's war on Gaza. More on that in just a second, but I do want to tell you, if you're new to us, if you're new to BungaCast, we're the global politics podcast at the end of history. Bear with me if you know all this already, but we release new episodes every Tuesday. I wanted to make that clear because maybe you just receive it on your podcatcher app or see a new episodes come out on social media, but you're not aware of when they are. It's always on Tuesday. And we also have additional episodes coming out on most Thursdays or Fridays. And while 2 episodes a month are free in this podcast, the rest of our episodes, if you want them in full, they're at patreon.com/bungacast. So there you'll find episodes with our regular contributors who joined us recently, and we're very excited about working with them even more. They're still kind of coming on board. We've done a couple episodes with them, but there will be plenty more to come. They are Alex Gurevich, Catherine Liu, Amber Lee Frost, and Lee Phillips. We also have episodes with writers and editors from Damage magazine, with whom we're now partnered, and so subscribers also get a free subscription to that magazine if you join up with us. And of course, there's plenty of original content over on the Patreon as well, with the Bunga Boys, the 3 original Bunga Boys, us 3, myself, Phil, and George, on matters like current affairs, on film, and much else besides, including also extended interviews. So if you like the sound of this, you should come over and join us at patreon.com/bungacast. Subscribers there get 4 original episodes a month that you can't get elsewhere, and that free subscription to Damage magazine. And I should say, if you've been with us for a long time, thank you very much. Thank you for being with us. But I should let you know that the old tiers are going to be phased out, but for just $2 more a month. So if you're paying $5, you only have to pay $2 more a month. You'll get at least double of what you were getting previously. So have a look at patreon.com/bungacast. That's all laid out there. Shout if you have any questions actually on this. But just to let you know, those old tiers are no longer visible and will be put out to pasture pretty soon. So we've been giving you all the content, including the new content, for free, as it were. But that will end soon. We're going to cut that back. So if you'd like to upgrade to the new tiers, we would really appreciate that, and we hope you will be with us, and we'll be sending us your questions, comments, criticisms, and so on, because as we always like to emphasize, this is an exploration of the contours of the end of history, of the collapse of the neoliberal era, and all the rest of it. And there's a lot more questions than answers. So we'd like this to be an ongoing discussion, as it has been for the 7 years that we've been doing this. But it's always worthwhile emphasizing. So, send us your questions, comments, post them on Patreon or indeed on social media, and we will discuss them on a regular basis on the Alpha bonus episodes. Right. What are we talking about today? So we're going to discuss, obviously, in first place, the protests across U.S. campuses against Israel's war on Gaza, in sympathy with the Palestinians, against Israel's ongoing occupation, and so on. Now, the big reason, obviously, that this has become a major flashpoint, indeed, it was the headline of the FT's news briefing, which I received on my phone on Wednesday morning. So just to emphasize how major of a story this is, I guess, that is the repression faced by protesters. So New York police stormed Columbia University, arresting many on Tuesday night. There was also an attack at UCLA by pro-Israel students on the pro-Palestine encampment. There's been repression at other campuses. And there's also a wider authoritarian context that has emerged on this issue specifically. So the U.S. House of Representatives, I believe just yesterday, passed an anti-Semitism bill which criminalizes speech against Israel. And it's a clear assault on freedom of expression. There's also the situation in Germany, which we've touched on in a recent episode, number 406, Alpha bonus, and we touched on other instances of censorship and clampdowns. But in Germany, the situation is one where expressions of solidarity with the Palestinians, of pro-Palestine sentiment, has been quite heavy-handedly clamped down on under the name of combating anti-Semitism. And it has created a very perverse situation there. But there was also the episode where police shut down the NatCon conference in Brussels. So this is obviously a kind of very much a cross-Atlantic phenomenon against dissent across a range of issues, often on matters which are not even that kind of that extreme or that far outside the mainstream. So I should say this: regular listeners will know, of course, that we support and defend free speech in any and all cases. And so we're very disturbed by the crackdowns on protest and on the wider restrictions on speech and dissent. That's in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. But we also think that that's probably the easy part, at least making that declaration and standing by that principle, as important as it is at least intellectually and maybe politically, the kind of the easier part. What we want to do here is we want to put the protests and clampdowns in a wider context. So we take it as read that student protests in general are limited at best. We don't want to rehearse all the critiques that we might have of student protests. I think they should come out probably at least tacitly as we go through this. But we also don't want to stand here and say, well, the protesters aren't achieving what they set out to do, or being critical of kind of what they're doing in a limited sense, because there's a lot more to be examined here. Whether we're sympathetic with what the protesters want or not, or whether they're explicit about what they want or not. Anyway, there's a lot to explore there, but we don't want to just sit here and go, aha, what kind of dumb students. If I were there, I would be doing it differently or whatever. We want to look at the wider politics. So that's the war on Gaza itself, the regional Middle Eastern scenario, obviously, but also the context of the Western left itself after the end of millennial socialism or left populism. And also at the end, I think we also want to touch on something which is important. It's a really big question, which we're not going to be able to deal with in full, but about whether we're entering a new era of war and how Israel and Palestine may or may not fit into that whole story. So there's a lot to kind of get on with, and we're going to start with the protest. Right, boys. What has been your initial impression of the protests? And I think maybe an obvious touch point, as we're, to be explicit and upfront about this, I'm in Brazil, George and Phil are in England. So we're observing this from afar and trying to collect reports and from social media and traditional media. What has been your impression of them? And how would you compare them perhaps to the last wave of protest in the US on a kind of bigger scale, which was Black Lives Matter's protests?
So up to a point, Alex, because these are protests. So I'm at listeners will, I assume most listeners will know, I'm at UCL, which is has got a kind of big campus at the core of London, and there are protests there as well, quite significant ones regularly on Saturday. So it's something which is happening here as well, though obviously what's in the news at the moment is the scale of the crackdown by city cops across, it seems like, the whole a lot of the eastern seaboard of the US, as well as more recently in UCLA. Though, interestingly enough, right, I wasn't, I mean, UCL is obviously a very elite institution at the global level and also at the national level. I was just on the place where I used to work, which is the University of Kent, where I live here in Canterbury, and not a lot, there didn't seem to be very much at all there visible. I mean, it's not kind of in the middle of term, but there didn't seem to be any of the paraphernalia of associated with pro-Palestine solidarity, for whatever that's worth, because that seems to me kind of a breach in the pattern of radicalism that used to be the case on the University of Kent campus. So it's something that's happening here as well. It's not just something that's in the UK, and that would be important to stress. In terms of the BLM, the contrast of the BLM, so this is something I think it's a good question whether or not it will take off in this particular context, and how it maps onto or diverges from the BLM protests, demonstrations, and riots. I think there are two big differences, and they're significant. The first is that BLM came out of the pressure cooker of lockdown. And I think that was a very significant factor in contributing to the general kind of atmosphere of fury and intensity, given people weren't certain about the future of their jobs, their lives, I don't know, all sorts of things, as well as being under de facto house arrest in so many places. So that was part of it. It was kind of, in a way, I think a lot of BLM, at least in the early phases, was a kind of de facto protest against lockdown, in fact, that took the form of this protest against historic racial injustice, as well as the specific incident of the police killing of George Floyd. The other element is it was deliberately stoked and fostered as a kind of as a way of undermining the Trump administration at the time. So it became caught up in partisan politics, party politics within America, and also as part of the it was a way the Democratic city governments also kind of were seceding from the policies of the federal government, the national government led by a Republican president. And that's different here. And I think that is why, because it's something which is essentially internal to the Democratic base and a core constituency of the Democratic base, which is to say the university campus, the Democrats want to contain it rather than to spread it and stoke it and exacerbate it. And so that, I think, means that it will have, I think, long-lasting repercussions, it will not reach the scale that we saw of the BLM protest, simply because the political machine won't kick into action behind it. So I think that's kind of, those two things I think are very significant differences.
Indeed, it'll be very big news if it does, I suspect, because it will have been doing it without the support of the political machine.
Well, it'll tell you the difference of that political machine, right? I mean, that's the important point, right? The guy, is Eric Adams, the
Mayor of
guy
New York.
who kind of ran up the flag, ran up the Stars and Stripes on the Columbia campus, taking down the Palestinian flag that the protesters had run up.
Like it was Iwo Jima or something.
Yeah, this kind of weird, kind of pathetic, like you say, Iwo Jima recreation. But he is. I imagine that would have been very different in the context of a BLM thing, right? He would have handled that very differently had it been a BLM thing, being a black mayor, right? So I think it's that is part of the way in which you can see the difference in how the Democratic Party machine, when it swings into action behind certain sort of protests and not others.
No, all very well said. So I guess my initial response, I'm not on social media, not even through kind of anonymous accounts. So I do think I probably have experienced this a little bit more slowly or less in continuous real time. But yeah, I think one thing that, even with that kind of caveat, that does strike me is that there is a similar starting point in terms of these protests and BLM, and this was didn't make it in this context, but at a talk last night at LSE, where I actually didn't see any kind of pro Palestine activity, but that could just be because of the particular room or particular bit that we were going into, talk at LSE by Pete Ramsey, and he said that the contemporary, I guess, social imaginary. So we did obviously the reading club on Benedict Anderson. It's no longer the imagined national community, which is limited and sovereign. Instead, it is this imagined state of nature, and it's imagined as cosmopolitan and based on vulnerability. And I think, you might think I'm stretching things maybe a bit too far here, but Alex, your piece in Damage on BLM and the triumph of American idealism, it's also the triumph of a certain sort of cosmopolitan idealism, I would say. So yeah, I think what's really kind of similar about the two is that they're these kind of American-led, global, cosmopolitan kind of frame, which then, I guess, is there to be transported potentially to the rest of the world. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I could see I don't want to make predictions, and if you do, you end up looking foolish. But there could be a kind of a similar BLM effect where we see campuses across the world kind of take on another Americanized kind of cause. So yeah, and we should probably link to that piece because I think it still holds up, that triumph of American idealism piece.
I mean, maybe to make the obvious point here, but the US is obviously a major sponsor of Israel. It funnels it a huge amount of money with which Israel then buys American produced arms. So America and America's citizens are immediately implicated in what is going on there. And without mentioning the perhaps more obvious point of the US being the global hegemon and empire, and therefore in some sense, its matters are the world's matters, and vice versa. Lamentable as that might be in many cases, and as I wrote in that article, it's unfortunate that the change kind of conception that we have, the change in consciousness that's happened, that's been greatly accelerated by the internet, means that we've lost a sense of the national space through which to examine things, and it means that it often flattens matters out, which makes we pretend we live in internet space when in fact, in reality, we don't. We live in still distinct nation states. Again, whether you want that or not, that is the reality. So I think that, I want to, before we get to the perhaps more analytical points, and some which might be more counterintuitive, to maybe make the more obvious points, which is simply that for a lot of American students, they're horrified by what they see going on and what Israel's actions are on just a human level, and that it is entirely makes sense. There's no need to overly analyze it or reach for psychological explanations for why people might be motivated to try to act because people are horrified and have an emotional instinctive reaction to that, and they know that their own government is complicit in that, and they think, well, I want to put a stop to that. There's nothing wrong with that. But of course, if that's where the story ends, then you have a problem, because that is not necessarily politics. And I think so we have to kind of get into this. I want to, before we just do that, I mean, I don't know if you guys have other comments, I guess, on the protest itself. We're going to come to a lot of the wider political context, and maybe we can return to it there. I want to turn to the question of repression and why this is happening now. So the repression of protests and the associated censorship, I should highlight again the way that this criminalization of anti-Semitism is outrageous. The anti-Semitism bill outlaws things like saying the creation of the state of Israel was a racist act, or telling a Jewish person that they have split loyalties, which really is an irony, because you could say this. You could say all these things. You could say the creation of the U.S. was a racist act, and many people do, or that, whatever, that the U.S. is just a history of barbarism and shouldn't exist. Call it Turtle Island or whatever else you like. You're allowed to do that because speech is protected in the United States, and that's a good thing. So you're allowed to continue to say that, but you won't be allowed to say these things about Israel. So, ironically, it would seem that the congressmen are the ones with split loyalties, who hold allegiance to Israel rather than to the United States. Now, that's not really what I think, but the point is that they really do open themselves up to that criticism. It is kind of outrageous, and I want to ask, I guess, the question that raises itself in my eyes is, why has this clampdown occurred on this issue? Because it seems that unlike past protests where to the extent that the police responded, it was a response in the name of order, right? It was a conservative response against disorder. Hey, you students, or hey, you protesters, shut up, stop causing a mess, go home. Whereas this seems to be very concerned with the content of the protests, right? If you look at all
Yeah.
so why is that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I guess my thought on this was COVID was Phil's mentioned it already, but lockdowns did see, and more generally, like the COVID era saw an increasing militarization of social relations and a generally higher level of authoritarianism, even if that authoritarianism doesn't have, as we say in the Taking Control book, and I took this point for a compact piece with the title, authoritarianism without authority. So you have this sort of situation where you are going to have always quite uneven policing of protests. There's always going to be some kind of I don't know, some kind of spin and some kind of politicization of policing, particularly in America. But it seems, I don't think I have a really good answer as to why it is that these protests seem to be much more unacceptable than BLM, because they are, as I said, they share that starting point, or at least in my view, and they are. I think one way to see these protests is, and we talked about this with Alex Gorovich on the episode we did with him, is that what's being projected onto Israel Palestine is a lot of what is America, what is the West, what are, all of these kind of things come to the fore. So maybe it is that kind of questioning of what America is, but that you could say has happened with BLM as well. That was a kind of a judgment that America's history and society was essentially in total unacceptable, racist, and could be discarded. So yeah, I think it does seem to be something about the content, not the form of the protest. So I think that the way that you put it is right.
I would hazard that there's maybe a dimension which is difficult to see from the outside, which is connected to, it's partly municipal politics, kind of the way in which certain university campuses sit in or relate to where they're based in relation to parts of the city. How residents around those campuses feel about it, how donors and funders behind major these incredibly kind of wealthy and influential public institutions that US Ivy League universities are, how they feel about it. And also, I suspect, particularly in places like New York, the influence of kind of the local Jewish community, which I think is probably more split on this question than is really acknowledged, and I'll make that point a bit later. So I think that's part of it, but I think I would hazard though venture kind of a larger thesis, which I think is a more substantial answer to your question, Alex. Why is it that what is it about the content of these protests? And I think because what it is essentially is a battle over the legitimacy of victimhood. And this is what gives the stakes of this, what makes it so bitter and intense. Because, Israel is the original kind of victim state. It's kind of claimed that status since, I'd say, probably since the 1970s, or perhaps since the Eichmann trial. But right, so you have this, and that is a crucial part of the legitimacy claimed, which Western states lay claim to in their defense of Israel, is their ability to defend the victim and the authority and the license that gives them. And that's territory that's being encroached on now by the protesters, right, who are saying that, in fact, the Palestinians, the victims of the Israelis, the victims of the victims are, in fact, the ultimate victims. So I think this is what gives it a particular kind of intensity and charge in ideological terms that otherwise wouldn't be present there. So I think, if you see it as a battle over that status, over, the protesters have laid a claim to a new global victim, and essentially the authorities, the Democratic Party machine, as well as Republicans like DeSantis in Florida, and others, they're kind of trying to claim that back. And so it's very telling that the American, this totally absurd anti-Semitism bill, that won't last, 5 minutes in front of the Supreme Court because it so clearly violates the US Constitution, right? This anti-Semitism bill is very clearly an attempt to it uses all of the same kind of the hostility to freedom of expression that is so typical of the campus left, completely absorbed now into the anti-Semitism bill, right?
Yeah,
and DeSantis is saying he's going to expel, I saw apparently he's going to expel students who protest against Israel from Florida high schools, completely absurd, and turning kind of the state of Florida into a safe space, essentially, for
yeah.
for Zionist politics. So that, the way in which they parallel each other in terms of their hostility to being able to engage in discussion. You have the classic kind of activism of the campus left and campus radicalism being claimed by state authority now. So anyway, I mean, I've made my
No,
point,
and
right?
I think that's right.
That's what's at stake.
I just had
and lamentably, one of the immediate upshots is that these people like DeSantis, or kind of the particularly, actually not even so much DeSantis, but the sort of dissident right, which has attached itself to anti-woke politics and in defense of freedom of speech, immediately show themselves to be the hypocrites we always knew they were, and then too many on the left draw the conclusion that see, free speech is fake and not a value worth defending or principle worth defending.
Because, they really deserve each other on that score.
Indeed, yeah.
Just a question, Phil. I think there's probably a lot of mileage in this idea of the battle over the legitimacy of victimhood. Is what you're saying also that the state authority also derives or must derive its legitimacy, at least in large part, from some relation to victims domestically, for it to react in this way?
Yeah, I think that would be consistent with what I'm saying. So, defending Israel abroad is the ideological keystone of being able to intervene anywhere in the world militarily on behalf of victims. That's the complementary kind of aspect of it. And domestically, that is the basis of the state's authority, right? Its ability to intervene in private life, its ability to police between different communities who are all kind of vulnerable to each other in different ways and need to be kept apart and managed by social workers and bureaucracies and cops and what have you. And so in that context, it's very important as to who can claim the right to speak on behalf of the victim. And if you challenge the state's authority to do that, that is actually at least ideologically dangerous. So I think this is what gives it this kind of intensity and bitterness, and also why, like I say, you see the way in which they this US state has escalated the stakes so absurdly with this completely idiotic and extreme and also redundant anti-Semitism bill. It's unnecessary, right? But they need to kind of make it that extreme. Who's the fourth member of Bunga there, Alex?
The great companion Sputnichka.
Interrupted.
My satellite.
I was on a great line there.
She didn't say anything. It was on mute.
You were just repeating yourself, Phil.
It's true.
Maybe.
I was elaborating the point. So I think I've made the point.
George,
I think, I don't want to say like, oh, that's the same point that I made, because obviously it's not, and you put it much more eloquently. But I think that's it, right? This cosmopolitan, vulnerable state of nature, that is the starting point, which the state then gets its authority from, its ability to protect us from each other and recognize that vulnerability. And I think, I think that must, the more I think about it and just hearing you talk about it, it must be right that the overreaction on the part of the police and the repression and the censorship, that shows that this is a particularly important ideological source of legitimacy for the contemporary state, at least in America. So I think
it'd be interesting to think. It'd be interesting to think how that, to what extent that is also relevant or becomes even more the case in the German context, where I think we've seen even greater absurdities there, where like Jews have been arrested, accused of anti-Semitism for challenging what Israel is doing. Anyway, I don't have to depict for people what
or
the
Jews being, what was it, the case of the Jewish American academic who has declined a major academic prize as a result of her statements about the war in Gaza and accused of anti-Semitism.
right.
So I mean, it's really extraordinarily absurd in Germany. Germany was definitely kind of the litmus test of idiocy in this instance, and that
And indeed,
was
yeah.
before America, and that is telling, I think, precisely because the German state makes it so explicit its attachment to Israel as the basis of its legitimacy, the modern federal German state. So.
And
Well,
also,
and indeed, as we've pointed out, Germany is I mean, I think we have to claim credit here in not foreseeing this specifically, but in kind of imagining that this derangement would happen in Germany, though not in this specific form necessarily, but as being the kind of post-historical country par excellence, already from 45 onwards, and certainly since the end of the Cold War, that once the end of history came for Germany too, that it would reach derangement levels which were perhaps more extreme and more perverse even than what has been seen in Britain or the US or elsewhere.
Yeah, though it's important, I think, to stress, like, it is the point about victimhood, right? I mean, it's not, because the outside of, somebody who who hasn't, who perhaps is deeply, moved by the plight of Palestinian suffering on television, their response will be, well, why are Western states so sympathetic to Israel, or disproportionately kind of sympathetic to Jews, right? The kind of the conspiratorial mindset. And that would be the mistake, right? Because it's not that they're Jews, right, but rather that it's the status of victims. And if you see it as if the aim is simply to replace the legitimacy of one set of victims with another, then nothing has changed really.
Well, I think that's right. I want to make a point about generations, but I should make a nod to a point made by one of our listeners, Bernhard. Hiya, Bernhard. About I was making a point in reference to the use and overuse of genocide to the extent that it dilutes it, or what seems to be the case, that one should only be motivated to action in the case of genocide, and war thereby becomes naturalized. The regular horrors of war are kind of just put into the background. So in relation to that, why is genocide always talked up so much? And I don't want to get into even the definitional debate about whether what is going on in Gaza is a genocide. I don't think it is. I think it's an attempt at ethnic cleansing, but not a genocide. But anyway, like the point is that it's horrific as it is. We don't need to constantly go back to kind of genocide. And his point, I think, which I think is interesting and stayed with me, is that genocide is the destruction of an identity, right? The destruction of a people. And because of that identitarian concern, that's why it has such potency and currency today. Of course, through overuse, it loses that currency or becomes ever more disputed, because if everything's a genocide, then nothing is. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. I want to just give a nod to that. But the other point is that there's, I think, a generational aspect going on here in the US, right? And it specifically in relation to American Jews. I will put in the show notes an essay by Samuel Biaggetti about the change in kind of American Jewry over the past century. I think it's a fascinating essay, came out in American Affairs 3 years ago, and actually therefore it ends up being quite prescient with regard to what's going on now. If that's of interest to you, I would recommend checking it out. But the point being that Jewish identity in the US, as recent migrants, was working class and attached to its traditions. And maybe one or the other, some were socialists and exclusively saw themselves as proletarian socialists and didn't really have much connection to the tribe and traditions and customs, whereas others were much more traditionalist. But nevertheless, that was the kind of the stuff of Jewish identity. But as Jews became much more integrated, became wealthy, became middle class, they're one of the most middle class or any wealthy groups in the United States, that their identity then became, because it's, they lived and it came to incorporate, or rather came to inhabit, a world of liberal international or liberal, effective, like liberal subjectivity, liberal belonging, etc., that what became core to their identity was Zionism, right? Support for Israel. And that remains the case for a lot of boomers, for a lot of the older generations, for Jews in the United States. the fact that the younger generation are breaking away from that and are kind of going, well, actually, what does Israel have to do with me? I reject what Israel does. I reject its colonialism. I reject its atrocity it carries out, the oppression of the Palestinians, etc. My home is the United States. I see myself as American. They might be losing their Jewishness. Some more traditional conservative Jews might worry about that. But for them, they see themselves as like, no, well, I'm American. I don't have any necessary connection to Israel. Anyway, so that plays out within kind of the Jewish community, such as it is, on a generational level. But I also think this plays out more broadly in the United States, insofar as there's the kind of younger generation doesn't identify so much with American nationalism or with the American nation, the American project. It's much more critical of it.
Well, I was going to say, Alex, I mean, that
because
seems to me to be part of it, right? I mean, I
well,
think you're right. There is kind of, I think there's too many reports, I think. And, you know, we've got kind of, I mean, one of our Bunga Extended Universe, Alex Gorovich, has made this point when, you know, Joe Biden, the American president, said that, you know, made the claim that Israel is necessary, the existence of Israel is necessary to protect Jews. He was essentially saying that America is incapable of protecting its Jewish citizens. So, I mean, just a class,
right,
or
right,
was
which is
couldn't
outrageous. Yeah.
or wouldn't wish to, you know, so kind of just a classic anti-Semitism. So, I mean, I think there is, you know, and you read reports about Jewish students praying next to Muslim students on some of these campus protests and what have you. So, I think there is probably a kind of a secession of American Jewry from the kind of the global claims that Israel makes on the loyalty of Jews everywhere. So I think that's probably is happening, but it's not necessarily buying into the American project.
No,
Or
no, but
and I think
what I would
that's important, right? Because you see also some of the protests are saying like, oh, you know, Israel is a genocidal colonial settler state, and so is America. And so you can't see this as something which is our struggle, like on behalf of the Palestinians, is also a struggle, a domestic struggle against our own country, right?
No, that's true. I mean, I was making a point, you know, secondarily about America, you know, a generational cleavage in general, or at least amongst within the American middle class, which is the younger generation doesn't identify so much with the American project, right? And that the reason that their opposition, because of America's interest, and you know, the American security state as well, has seen its interest so closely tied to that of Israel, to challenge Israel's actions, but also it challenged Israel's legitimacy and its very existence, is seen to be challenging the United States' very existence as well. And it's interesting because I want to make reference. It's worth checking out. Our friends over at Sublation did an episode on this. Doug Lane interviewed a Greek woman who lives in the United States, an academic historian, Dr. Electra Kostopoulou. And it's very interesting because I think she's very, very clear. I disagree profoundly with what she presents, but she is part of this movement called the Uncommitted Movement, which is trying to basically punish the Democrats for their support for Israel and for Netanyahu. I don't know how far that'll go. I suspect that it'll end up looping back to support for the Democrats ultimately, but that's a question which we will come to in a second. But more specifically with regard to this is that she says, no, this is an existential issue. Israel-Palestine is an existential issue, and it's as essential for the United States, right? And I think that sort of claim, I think the protesters believe that, and the authorities who are of an older generation are reacting to that, and hence the brutality of the repression, the heavy-handedness of the repression to the protests, because it's seen as being kind of deeply, fundamentally anti-American in a sort of cosplay replay of the 1960s.
I mean, you know, I think so. A lot of people are saying it's a kind of a replay, and I think it's worth, you know, so having spoken about the peculiar intensity and extreme character of the crackdown, and also comparing the situation in the U.S. to Germany, and you know, thinking about how American Jews kind of fit into it, comparing it to the historic kind of anti-war protests in the 1960s, I think the differences are as instructive as the similarities, you know, in certain important ways. I mean, so for a start, right, you have the fact that that was, well, the American state supports Israel. Israel will exist without the support of the American state. It's a nuclear armed state. It's not kind of just a puppet. It's not just a puppet state as South Vietnam was. And also, America was directly involved in supporting the South Vietnamese state against the communist insurgency and North Vietnam, which is different from the relationship with the Israeli state. So I think that those are significant differences. But I think it's also telling that I mean, if the Vietnam era war protesters at their best, they betted on the validity, on their kind of most politically kind of conscious, at their most politically conscious, they betted on the validity of Vietnamese unification as a historic, as something which was historically worthwhile. It's in contrast to, I think that's very different from solidarity with the Palestinian. The claims of the Palestinians. The difference being, that the Palestinians are a defeated nation. It's just thinking, I mean, if you think of it historically, the prospects for Vietnamese unification much better and more historically significant, I think, than the prospects for independent Palestinian nationhood, which would only ever. I mean, it's not going to happen, right? Because Israel, like I say, is a nuclear armed state, and the Israeli Jews aren't going anywhere. And whatever that looks like, it would inevitably be kind of limited. If it was a two-state thing, it would inevitably be kind of limited and compromised. And so that political, whatever the political claim being advanced on behalf of the Palestinians is, it seems to me it's of a very different character from claiming, saying kind of, ho 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 Chi Minh, the Viet Cong are going to win, right?
Well, I was going to
That's a
say,
very
no
different.
one, despite all the charges of anti-Semitism directed at the protesters, no one, or hardly anyone really, is out there chanting "Ha ha ha Hamas," right? And I think it's because for all
No,
that they're.
I think there is plenty of,
I
you see
think, but the
plenty of
thing is, to the
sympathy.
extent that it exists, it's a kind of crypto Islamism. It is not full throated in that regard, because the thing is like, let's not pay attention to the fact that Gaza specifically is run by Hamas, and that is kind of the political representatives of the movement as it stands now. Let's ignore that. They're the victims, and Israel are the perpetrators. So, all support to the Palestinians. But they don't go, actually, I share the goals of Hamas specifically as an organization. I think that gets kind of brushed over in the way that actually many
Okay,
leftists in the
yeah.
1960s would have said, no, I stand actually with the Viet Cong.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's probably fair.
Yeah. So
I mean, in some ways, I think it makes it worse because they give so much licenses extended, effectively, unconsciously extended, to Hamas as claiming to speak on behalf of the Palestinians,
and
precisely
and,
because
and
they're
and it's
unwilling
depoliticized,
to openly criticize them.
because
Yeah,
it's
and
like,
that,
no, let's not concern ourselves with who,
yes,
what the
yes,
Palestinians politics are, whatever. The
yes,
point is that they're the
indeed, yeah.
victims.
So, just I guess on this, I mean, this might be fairly obvious points, but this kind of, how does this current kind of set of student protests compare to those of the late '60s? I guess one response to anti-Vietnam War sentiment was essentially like, this is un-American, but I don't think like this is, or at least I haven't seen that particular criticism of the campus protests at the moment. So there's not this idea that you have the American. I mean, because historically, this was a period where you had the American project, you had American hegemony, you had something, if you were an American student, potentially to aspire to, or to kind of say, well, America's better than this. We shouldn't be kind of intervening over here. But there is no higher standard that contemporary students can hold America to. There is a very, there's a American hegemony has unraveled, and there is no appeal to
But also,
a kind
America's
of
a
greater
genocidal
project.
colonial settler state as well, right?
So it's
So
kind of,
that's the
what do
point.
you, plague on both your houses? What do you expect from from the US? So I think that is a something which isn't similar. I also read the have this in the show notes, but a piece by Benjamin Studebaker where he cites a poll that only 2% of Americans say that war in the Middle East is the number one concern. And this, and he does say this, like, you don't want to let the polls dictate reality. But this, it does seem like it is more of, I don't know what the equivalent would have been in the height of anti-Vietnam War protests, but it does seem a more concentrated concern than Vietnam did, because of course
American soldiers aren't dying in the Middle East.
Yeah,
exactly, because of the lack of mass participation through actually sending Americans over there.
I mean, they had conscription, right?
We'll come on to this,
the,
but I think this is a major change in anti-war politics, which is too often brushed under the carpet, or just entirely ignored. Which is that anti-war politics often, began. There was a strong constituency for anti-war politics at home because it was precisely the soldiers from home who were going off and dying somewhere, and that is the case whether it was war in Europe in the first part of the 20th century or up through to Vietnam, and no longer. And I think that changes a lot of the complexion of anti-war politics, which we'll come on to in the final section. I think it's also worth dwelling just a second on what's happening within the university, the internal campus dynamics, what the actions have been of university administrators, and their role in bringing in the police.
Yeah, so I think I'm happy to talk about this. Obviously, I suppose having the most direct contact with campus still of the three of us, because the most striking thing I think about the breakup of the encampments and the cops rampaging around campus in these American cities is the fact that they were called in by university administrators. And that's, obviously speaks to the dereliction of the people running universities. But I think it also speaks in a way to the students' own attitudes towards the university as well, in a sense. So if the listeners, viewers will indulge some personal kind of anecdote. So back in 2010, this was about a year after I'd started my permanent job back then at the University of Kent having just joined as a lecturer. And this was during the time of the fees protests. And there was an occupation. So this was the big kind of protest against the hiking up of fees on the UK. And there was a lot of talk at the time about the return of student protest politics and what have you. And at the time, Kent was one of the most radical bastions of student protest. They had their reputation from the 60s, kind of a hangover, but also it was during this fee kind of cycle of protests over fees, it was also the places where the disruption lasted the longest. And on the campus, the students took over this, the so-called Senate building, which was the core. It's kind of at the literal center of the campus at the university, but also it is kind of the supposed to be the center of power in the university, in the sense like it's where the highest constitutional body within the university would sit. So this was occupied by the students, and they were fairly heavy-handed in how they tried to eject the students. They put security guards at the front of the building, preventing people from. They let people leave, but they didn't let people enter. They shut down the heating, and all of this. And eventually, the protest petered out. But there were two important parts to this story. The first is that the Senate doesn't actually run the university anymore. So the university is run by a very small executive group of managers in a kind of CEO style body. So the Senate is a kind of constitutional body with the name borrowed from the language of formal politics. It doesn't really have that power anymore. And so the students were kind of misdirected in occupying what they assumed to be the most powerful, the center of power at the university, which it wasn't. The second thing was, after the protest petered out, the university made the Senate building a licensed premises. right? Which is to say that it made it legal to serve alcohol on those premises. Very odd, right? You'd think to make it legal to serve alcohol on a premises which is supposed to be for formal business in running the university. And the reason they did this is because it would make it easier to call cops onto campus, right? Because the cops can be called to oversee a
Wow.
licensed premises that is, right, becoming disruptive or unruly, right? You can call cops to a pub, which is, kind of after closing hours where things are getting unruly and so on. So this was a deliberate ploy to make it easier to call cops onto campus. And this was 2010, bear in mind, right? And so that was the point that I realized that there was no meaningful contract or compact between the upper tier of the university and the student body. And so that told you just how much the universities, this was in Britain, but I think the point is also proved by what's happening in the States now. There's no sense in which there is a mutual or reciprocal relationship between the people who run the university, who are not really longer the professoriate, even in the sense of being people who are still connected to the process of research and teaching. And there's no kind of sense that they have duty or responsibility to each other, right? Or that the professors could seek to persuade the students, talk the students down, offer them some concessions on the basis of their power, to within the university, offer to host a debate about the issue, whatever it might be, right? Instead, they call in the cops, and that just speaks to the fact that kind of instinct, authoritarian instinct, speaks to the way in which the university has been totally consumerized, essentially. So at the other end, I think it's also the fact that the students themselves so often see themselves as consumers, who are entitled to certain kinds of things because they've paid money.
Yeah.
And that drives a lot of the student authoritarianism at the other side as well.
Well,
The lack of thought to kind of entertain alternative points of view. Now, I mean, it's very
so
clear that
I just wanted to jump in. And I mean, there's two things to note which have just come across on social media. One is that it's been a joke that's gone around social media that Columbia University had achieved the dream of the contemporary university, which is to say no scholars, no students, and all administrators. That's all that's left in the building.
yeah.
The other, with regard to the students, is, I mean, there's an interesting clip of Finkelstein giving a speech at Columbia, I believe. And apologies if I misconstrue this in any way. It's just a clip I saw from Twitter. So if it's, if I've fallen for deep fake, my deepest apologies, actually. But it does seem to be that Finkelstein is giving a talk to the students and saying, look, don't try to just wind your opponents up. Don't try to be provocative. Stop saying from the river to the sea, because that can be misinterpreted. Even if you mean it in the best way, you don't actually mean to kind of get rid of every Jew in the Levant. Never. Even if you don't mean that, and you mean it on the best intent, don't use that. Think about what you're saying. Try to be strategic, right? Which I think was entirely appropriate. As he leaves the stage and gives the mic over to his, I think what it seems to be a student, and she gets up and she immediately comes to the mic and she goes, from the river to the sea, right, with a smirk on her face. So it's like it does tell a little bit. I think it's just one incident, but a little bit of like the
Yeah.
frisson
I
that you
mean,
get from that.
sure. And I mean, I suppose that's been kind of, youth rebellion for as long as there's been youth,
Oh, for
right?
sure. I've done that in the past. I've had, people going, look, let's be smart, cool down. Don't be an idiot about this. And you're like,
Yeah.
and you jump in and you're like, I'm going to be as much of an idiot as possible.
Yeah, but that's slightly different, I think, from the specific characteristics of, kind of banning people from speaking on campus, deplatforming, and so on. That is
Yes.
the attitude of the angry consumer rather than just a kind of an angry youth. Not least because also it's something which is entirely endorsed and sanctioned by so many faculty. Anyway, I mean, the only point there is, I think it's very clear the administrators bear the most blame for for all the kind of some of the ugliness and the outright or close, kind of skirting anti-Semitism of some of what's happened on campus and what have you. It's clear to me that it is the administrators that are very clearly at fault in inviting the state to manage the internal relationships of the university community, and that is not something they will easily retreat from. And I also fear that the lesson won't be learned on the other side either. That rather than restoring, making an effort to restore the self-governing idea of a self-governing community, which doesn't need to rely on the kind of the force of the state to manage its internal disputes, I fear that probably won't be, that won't be the lesson learned, particularly in the context that we're in at the moment. So anyway, it's only to I think the dereliction of university administrators and managers is a very clear aspect of the authoritarian character of what's happening on the campuses at the moment.
Yeah, no, very good. It does seem to me that this also would run against a certain conservative critique of the university as being a kind of walled off area of, kind of walled off ivory tower, disconnected from society. Because although it may seem like that sometimes in terms of the ideas that are produced, what I think this episode shows, and everything that you've been saying, Phil, is how interpenetrated it is by the state, how open it is to other discourses and practices and ways of managing things. For example, consumerism, right? It's completely consumerized. And so the university does not exist as a space walled off in which its members owe things to one another, right? Are responsible exclusively to one another, scholars to each other as a community of scholars, and to their own students. It's in fact kind of exists exactly like any other institution in society, which is to say completely sort of blown up and open to intervention.
Yeah, and even worse now, that its leaders manage their internal disputes using the state directly,
Yeah.
the force, kind of armed force of the state directly. So.
I did just want to put this in the context of the left, and this is probably the bit we'll probably get the most shit for. So let's go. This obviously comes in the on the other side of left populism, where the Anglophone left and the Western left probably as a whole has lost its orientation, but particularly in the Anglophone countries where Bernie and Corbyn channeled and absorbed and concentrated so much left-wing and radical energy. And now it's all behind the Gaza question, right? And there's very good reasons for wanting to stop Israel's actions in Gaza. Indeed, they should be stopped. We should try to think about what leverage we might have. I live in a country in which my government is doing that, and there's not much point in protesting against my government here at home. Maybe in Britain there's a place to be to do that, right? In challenging Britain's support for Israel, and that purely on, I guess, humanitarian grounds. And that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, endorsing humanitarian politics, right, of humanitarian intervention. But I know Phil will want to come in on this. So how maybe to ask a question which you might disagree with the premise of it, but say, as we're being a bit critical of the protesters, how do we stop Israel?
How do we stop Israel? It's
a big we. It's not just Bungacast, right?
How do podcasters stop Israel? Sounds like a really great topic, Alex, for
increased output.
A conference. Yeah, we should have have a call for papers
okay. Yeah. I mean, I asked a dumb question, and I was explicit about it being dumb. But let me rephrase it a little bit more pointedly. But the U.S. certainly has leverage, and it would seem to me right that there should be protests there in the U.S. for the U.S. to stop Israel's actions or to stop funding Israel. Indeed, even many Israelis, in fact, on the Israeli right, are interested in that because they want more autonomy. So I think maybe it's worth thinking through this.
Like, on what grounds is it worth? If it's John Mearsheimer, the Chicago professor, IR professor, and realist critic, both of America's policy over Ukraine and over Israel, he says we should just treat Israel as any other nation. The America should just treat Israel as any other nation.
Mm-hmm.
which is to say that we don't have any kind of special claim on them. They don't have any special claim on us. And that's, so you could say it's not in America. Do you say that we shouldn't support Israel because what they're doing to the Palestinians is terrible? We shouldn't support Israel because it is not in America's national interests to support Israel and what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. We should support the Palestinians rather than supporting the Israelis. On what grounds, are you opposing what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians? Is it because it's the humanitarian suffering that that is being the suffering that's being inflicted on the Palestinians? In which case there are many conflicts in which you might be motivated by the suffering, and many conflicts which are far less visible and prominent. Why does their suffering matter so much less than the suffering of Palestinians? So all of these questions are kind of pertinent, right? On what political grounds would you oppose Western support for Israel? Traditionally, the claim was that because Israel was the ally and the regional kind of policeman on behalf of the West against Arab nationalism and against the forces of Arab socialism and communism. And that was the grounds that the left would have opposed Western support for Israel from the 70s, the 80s, and maybe even into the 90s. But, that's no longer the case because there is no Arab nationalism or socialism to speak of. So, none of these questions are answered properly. I had something of an exchange with a former guest of ours, David Jamieson from Conter, and listeners will see one of his pieces in the show notes. We had something of an exchange about this over Twitter, but I don't see any wider discussion of these kinds of questions in relation to Israel Palestine among the anti-war left.
Yeah,
Well,
I think it's. I mean, it seems to me quite clear that the demands are made on a moral basis. Like, this is wrong, so don't do it, rather than any political demands in the sense of this is not in our national interest, so we shouldn't do it. And so therefore it does seem pretty intractable in terms of, on what basis are you compelling your politicians to take a certain course of action, either arguments to national interest or, I guess, kind of domestic political calculations. I mean, this is why, people who are threatening to withdraw their support from the Democrats, that is, a potential kind of option. But my instinct is that this is not possible, or more when the rubber hits the road. And the vote comes about. If you've been saying that Trump is a threat to democracy, then you have to vote for the alternative. So there doesn't seem, that is not a credible threat. You've already said that that it is a bluff, essentially. So I think unless the argument is made in terms of what is the national interest of the US and all of us, what is our country's national interest, and how can we apply more democratic pressure to foreign policy and make it more democratic, it seems like it is a it is a purely moral set of arguments, which
I mean, I think the protesters,
you know,
I'm fairly confident would argue that they are trying to have democratic influence over America's foreign policy. Obviously, the end goal is a moral one, which I think doesn't go much beyond, firstly, ceasefire, immediate and permanent ceasefire, and secondly,
that's exactly the opposite. I mean, making that claim, the first claim instead, and Alex Gorovich puts this in an excellent piece in the Northern Star from January, that the first thing has to be to demand congressional authorization of any current or future use of military force.
Yeah.
That's that's what the protesters are not interested in doing. They're instead taking the shortcut and not having democratic control. And that's why. Sorry, I didn't mean to kind of interrupt you to just say you're wrong.
But they are trying to. But how are they not trying to have control if they're saying the U.S. should divest from Israel, stop giving so much military aid, or stop military aid as a whole for Israel? That is trying to exercise democratic control over.
But not on the principle of that of greater democratic control over U.S. foreign policy. Right?
Well, presumably they would be in favor of that in general. I don't think they would. They're like,
No,
well,
I
on
don't
this
think
issue,
so.
stop, but
That's
in
the
general,
point.
leave it to the
But then the
CIA.
question, why? And the question, why don't they? Right? Why don't you hear that demand being made? Right?
Well, because the
And
issue is reduced purely to the immediate and the moral, which is to say, stop
that
Palestinian
goes,
suffering.
but that goes back, yeah. So it goes back to the problem, right? I think. I mean, it's still it's motivated on behalf of Palestinian suffering rather than a meaningful kind of getting behind a proposition, a kind of a meaningful political proposition to end the conflict, or to reorient foreign policy in a different direction, beyond kind of not doing nasty things.
So,
Right. So, I mean, it's entirely based on humanitarian claims. So, for instance, right, Lord Cameron, our dipshit new foreign secretary here in the UK, has suggested that British Marines, might be involved in dispersing aid to Gaza. Right. And very clear attempt to both to kind of involve the British military in the region, which I think speaks to the direction in which things are traveling in terms of internationalizing the conflict in humanitarian terms. But also, I imagine many of the protesters, right, would they be in favor of that or against it? On what grounds, right? Um, because the sympathy or the solidarity with the Palestinians is humanitarian, I think probably many of the protesters would probably support British troops being deployed to Gaza, because it would be seen as some protecting delivery of aid from the Israelis, right? Rather than
And
as
hmm,
boosting British authority in its old imperial territory and a return of Britain's humanitarian claims and boosting the authority of the British state to oversee and distribute aid, and intervene in any part of the world that it wants to. And that is completely invisible in the debate. I wanted to cycle back to something though, because I think there is an important aspect of this, which is I don't think I agree, George. I think there could be, so you see, kind of in swing states, there's a large Arab Muslim vote in Michigan, for instance, and if they turn against the Democrats, it might help to chisel away electoral college votes for Biden in the presidential election. And I think, the heavy-handedness and the thuggishness with which the cops have, you've seen the photos of cops knocking over elderly professors protesting, brutalizing students, and also kind of preventing people from moving around campus freely, standing outside of dormitories and housing and so on. I think all of that heavy-handedness and thuggishness, which has been deployed in order to clear the encampments and the protesters, I think that will be, that will be very important political experience for a whole generation, and they will remember it for a long time. So even though I don't think it's going to be, it's not going to um, significantly, it's not going to blow up like BLM did for the reasons we've already said at the start. But I think it will be the way in which the campus left, or some of the campus left, retreat away from the Democrats. And this is a point that you've made, Alex, that the very fact that the radical left, the campus left, is using Gaza as a way of retreating from, to cover up the defeat of left populism, and to retreat from centrist hegemony of Joe Biden and Keir Starmer here in the UK by protesting the Labour Party and the Democrats' policies over Gaza and over Israel. That seems to me that in itself is deeply problematic, right?
yeah, I mean, this
Because
is amazing, right?
their
Like,
critique of centrism is based on a moral question of foreign policy, rather than a political critique or disagreement over domestic policy of what these parties are doing, or even really over the national interest or foreign policy of these parties.
I mean, we should be even
That
more.
is very
Yeah,
important.
no, we should be more explicit about this. I mean, in the U.S., Bernie supporters were Bernie himself was completely rat fucked by the Democratic establishment, and yet they still voted for Biden in 2020. Right? Despite that, they didn't break with the Democrats. They still kind of trudgingly went to the polls to keep Trump out. Right? So that they didn't break with the Democrats then, and yet now at this moment in time over Israel, however horrible what Israel is doing, and you say, well, there's people dying there, whereas no one's dying in the U.S. Blah 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 blah. At this moment in time, they go, this is the straw, and not even just the straw that breaks the camel's back, but this is the great big piece of lumber that falls down and breaks the camel's back. So I find that needs further inquiry into why that is the case. Why this? Why now? And I think it relates. I think ultimately this will lead back to the Democratic Party at some point. So I'm not saying that this is a permanent break with the Democratic Party. Indeed, it might lead to a reconfiguration down the road of the Democratic Party, as has already begun, with the squad to a certain extent. It's sort of a slight kind of political reorientation. And it might indeed lead to a different politics within the Democratic Party with regard to Israel, especially as this generation kind of goes into politics. I think that will be the case, but I think it still remains the case that to say that actually we're not buying the blackmail anymore of Trump the fascist and that he must be stopped at all costs, vote blue no matter who, should be done over Israel, I think I don't have a clear answer for why that is.
Well,
It speaks to the
I'm
bankruptcy of the millennial left.
I'm not sure I agree with the two of you. I still think that it's kind of posturing, essentially, not to be, too reductive, but I do think that the move away from the Democrats on the basis of this conflict will not be realized. That is an empirical prediction, and if and if I'm wrong, then we can replay this, and it will be the first time I think
We'll
I've ever
see.
been wrong on anything. But I think it's a question. What is a
I think the
deeper?
listeners got the irony there in your voice, George. So that's good.
Maybe. I mean, this is definitely inviting a lot of examples of me being wrong, but find them if you can. No, but I think it's like, what is the deeper frame? Is it that Trump is a danger to democracy, or that genocide Joe? Like, what is the kind of the more deeply held position?
So,
And it will be tested this year, so we will have answers.
so I disagree. I mean, we'll see. You're right. Let's see how it breaks down. I would disagree with you, Alex, though, on one thing. I think there's two things. So there is a layer of Zoomers, kind of radical student Zoomers, 18, 19, 20, 21 year olds, who are being kind of drawn, who are being radicalized by Gaza. And they will remember, what it looks like to be, they'll remember what it's like when the shock of being on the other side of an American cop in full riot gear with batons on your university campus. For the middle class youth that go to elite Ivy League universities, that is something that will be an important part of their
Mm.
political outlook, right? Um, but it's also the retreat of the millennial left. I think they are retreating under the cover of the dispute over Gaza. They failed with left populism. They failed with Bernie. They failed with Corbyn, like you say, and they still ended up voting for Labour. They still ended up voting for the European Union. They still ended up voting for Biden, despite everything that happened, and Hillary, indeed. Right. So, and now they're withdrawing from politics over this case. So I think it's a kind of a last hurrah. So one generation is being drawn in, and one generation is pulling back. And that generation of the millennial left, they are going into, I think they're retreating into essentially political quiescence, which will be tinged with embitterment and, in particular, hatred of Israel, and that will
Well,
be something that will stick with them as they
what
kind of go into political retirement, essentially.
a related point, I think. Actually, just to finish off your point, that we have discussed the parallels with the 1960s and after, right, and the kind of withdrawal that came in the 1970s. Of course, there's many different contextual differences, but I think this might be another one also, right, where it's the millennials who have the experience of the so-called Great Awakening, of a certain radicalization, of the experience of Bernie and Corbyn, and then deflated, they recede and withdraw, and with quite a lot of force. The stronger the wave comes in, the harder it pulls back out to sea. And so I think you might be right on that, Phil. There is another point about the left, which has been, which the moralization of the conflict, and indeed the brute reality of Israel's atrocities and a war which won't achieve its own strategic ends and won't provide Israel with security or peace, making it all the more horrible. That reality has obscured the left's unwillingness to think about strategy, unwillingness to think about who it's actually in solidarity with in Palestine as a political organization, not just with people who are being brutalized, and has disguised its awfulness over October the 7th. Because, of course, even me mentioning October the 7th now will be met with, how the fuck can you be talking about that when what Israel has done is a million times worse than anything that than Hamas did on October 7th, right? But the immediate reaction to that was effectively to cheer on Hamas, right? And to kind of glory in that, in the same way that some people did over the Charlie Hebdo massacre.
Lee
Say basically they had a
Phillips.
killing.
Yeah, like Lee Phillips said, the hang glider left, right?
Exactly.
The people who
And
supported
the left is rather lucky that yeah, I mean, this is it sounds horrible. The left is lucky that Israel has been so brutal in its response, because it has allowed it to focus, under a very justifiable moral cover on what Israel is doing, and has never really had to think about what its immediate response is, or its lack of real, genuine political response to the situation there. What its vision is, I think, and this is kind of communicated through a lot of the protesters and just the general discourse around Israel and Palestine, is that there are only two players on the board game, right? And that's ideological, right? As in it kind of mystifies to a certain extent or warps the picture, but it also relates to a certain reality, right? So the picture is the United States and Israel. These are the only two agents on the board. And then you have the object, the victim, which are the Palestinians, right? So there is no vision of Palestinian statehood, really, to the extent that it would be either a two-state solution, which would be a kind of, supported by the UN. It wouldn't be genuine sovereignty for the Palestinians, or it would be maybe a one-state solution, which is a fantastical vision, and one which would be probably kind of anti-Semitic, which would involve the removal of Jews from Israel as well. Right. So those are the kind of the two actual political visions of statehood. But for the vast majority of protesters, I think neither of those are really broached as serious end goals to which one can develop a strategy. Mainly, it remains within the kind of moral frame of stopping Israel, right? Stopping this horrible stuff that Israel is doing, which, again, that would be a good thing if that happened. But we have to think beyond that. And the only actors on the board are the United States, which enables Israel to do this. And if we can stop the United States, we can stop Israel, and we can have a permanent ceasefire. And that no further questions, please, because I don't have any further answers. And I think that's where we are.
There's no getting away, the comparison with radicalization in the 1960s, there's no getting away from it, kind of the Vietnamese nation wasn't a losing proposition, whereas the Palestinian nation is a losing proposition, particularly when you don't have any kind of political goal or outlook that you're, kind of adding your support to through your protest domestically. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important support for.
Not to mention the wider geopolitical thing, because like you've got, like China is friendly with Israel, right? So it's not like you're siding with in a kind of Cold War scenario with the other side, which from maybe Stalinist was the case.
The point is, like, to choose. I think it's significant that the campus left is so heavily invested in a political project that is defeated already, surrendered at Oslo, the Palestinian Versailles, as Edward Said put it, but also has no, kind of realistic prospect or hope of consummating its political goals in the middle, in the long term, in the middle term, or in the short term. As opposed to holding that Vietnam would be better off unified rather than partitioned and divided, and that seems to me that's a significant difference, right, in terms of how you relate to extending your political support to another actor, whether the political characteristics of that actor, their capacity to change their own situation, their agency and capacity to shape a kind of a regional or a global political context, all of those are significant things. And the fact that the Palestinians have no agency, I think, is their main characteristic is victimhood. That is a very important part of their appeal to the left, because it
Yeah.
means that it's much easier to speak on their behalf without being held to account, and also being able to claim to speak for them without risk of them doing anything independently of you, right? So
But the left recognize, I mean, the left knows this without knowing it, right? The moral and political pressure exclusively on US and Israel basically stop them doing this without any positive support for Palestinian secular national cause is a tacit recognition that the Palestinian struggle is dead, right? So I think they know this, but they don't
yeah, you're
admit it to
right.
themselves.
At some level, they recognize it in their action, and that speaks to the moralized character of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to kind of engage in too much pop psychologizing, but it does, I guess, alter the effective orientation that you have towards, towards another struggle. If that struggle is fundamentally unwinnable, it will make you, if you're sympathetic to that struggle, more angry, more, um, I don't know, more despairing, but also more kind of rageful. So, and I mean, that sort of seems to play out to a certain extent. But I think the political point you hit the nail on the head, Alex, that there isn't a plausible kind of agent of the Palestinian struggle that can be supported. So things have to necessarily be vaguer and more negative. Vaguer in terms of what is kind of being asked for, and more negative in terms of attacking Israel or via the US. So I think and we talked about this with Alex Gorovich again, his name coming up a few times in the episode that we did, and yeah, there isn't a political solution on either side.
Yeah, and to preempt the criticism, which is inevitable whenever I post on this, whenever we comment on this, etc., which is like, how can you be talking about this, or you are misguided? You're focusing on small matters at the expense of the big one, which is what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And ultimately, I'm willing to listen to your answers, but without politics, you have no power, and therefore all you have is shouting into the void, which is unfortunately what we're all doing. So without a reconstruction of politics, there is no influencing matters on the ground, however grave, and that's very serious. So we're going to move on now to the final point, which relates to these matters.
For the record, I mean, I don't think it's in Britain's national interest to support Israel. But it doesn't seem to me that there's any of that. And I don't think it's in Britain's national interest to support the Palestinians either, for that matter. But that isn't registered at all in the debate. So, if anybody who's listening or watching happens to be interested in my view, that's my view. So, for the record.
I think that's but the just a minor point on this, the humanitarian frame makes things more urgent than this. There isn't a time to work through questions of democratic control and solve issues of national interest. It has things,
and that's exactly the
need to
purpose of the
happen
humanitarian
yesterday.
framing. Yeah, it's intended to disable political responses and thought, which was always the kind of intention of the humanitarian emergency framing, was the context of blackmail, and that is essentially that's essentially what's being done, right?
Well, I mean, it may be worth actually just briefly. I'm getting distracted here or sidelined, but sidetracked. That's the word. But David Jemison, who writes this response, and I would respond to him because he's a friend and makes some interesting points. But I will disagree with him because his point, making kind of targeting critics, both of kind of post-liberal persuasion as well as those kind of on the left, who've made these critical points on Israel and on Palestinian solidarity, which is that yes, there is no politics on the ground in Palestine right now, which proposes itself as a plausible, even if in the future, of a kind of secular national liberation, and therefore, but never, so the points that we would make that are critical of it still apply. his point is that no, but there always has been another possibility there, merely a possibility, but was the Arab Street. And there was the Arab Spring that happened, where the so-called Arab Street rose up, and that might, the actions of ordinary Arabs in various countries in the region might change the configuration of Israel, and indeed might lead to the formation of a Palestinian state. I mean, I think that's worth dwelling on, because I think to the extent that we've made a critique here, it's based on the fact that there is on the ground, as a kind of empirical point, that there is no Palestinian politics which have the capacity to form its own state, or certainly none that we would want to support. I don't think Hamas has any chance, but if it did, I still wouldn't support it because it's Hamas. But the question about a general Arab uprising, I think, is interesting. But I think what was notable about the Arab Spring is how little impact it did have on the Palestinian situation. Even, so obviously, maybe if there had been a democratic revolution, a successful democratic revolution, which had institutionalized itself in Egypt, perhaps that might have changed matters for the Palestinians. I don't know how. Go on.
So I think there's I think with I think David is always worth engaging with as an intelligent and thoughtful interlocutor, where the debate is there is movement in the debate. So it's useful, it's useful to think about what he said. And I disagree. I disagree with it along lines that you say, Alex. That was the old Palestinian claim of the Palestinian radical left, was first of all deal with the reactionary Arab dictatorships as a precondition, as the precursor to a showdown with Zionism. And that was, what they tried to do. And so the idea was a democratic. A more democratic and more unified Arab world would be in a much stronger position to respond to Zionism backed by Western imperialism. And that claim, that seems to me, obviously it failed in the Cold War, but also the Arab Street was defeated, and that was, it's kind of the great moment of the Arab Spring. The high tide of that has receded, and all that's left in its wake is jihadi insurgency and strengthened dictatorships. With Egypt, being kind of the classic, the example of that, of the strengthened dictatorship, and Syria being the example of jihadi civil war and insurgency. So the idea that the Arab, the Arab Street is now going to rally on behalf of the Palestinians, that seems to me that's indulging in fantasy politics of the past.
Well, I'm sure people would at this point are going, well, then what would you propose? But we can come back to that, and maybe we will come back to it when we deal with your questions and comments in a future episode. I wanted to turn to kind of the last section, which I've grandiloquently titled World Historical Zoom Out. I didn't know what else to say, but
World Historical Zoomers.
Yeah. So it seems to me that the Israel-Palestine conflict, in a way, is one of these ghosts of the 20th century, which is a point that I've touched on in past episodes, where these ghosts kind of float through the air as legacies, seeming to retain the same form of the 20th century, but with the content evacuated and increasingly increasingly disfigured. I don't know if a ghost can be disfigured, but maybe it's a half zombie, half ghost. Anyway. And
stop right now.
Israel-Palestine seems to be part of that, because it's one of those conflicts which was held in place and fomented and held in place by the Cold War, rather like apartheid South Africa. And apartheid South Africa was defeated and disappeared off the face of the earth, not so much because of boycotts in the West, because people stopped buying South African oranges, but because the Cold War came to an end, and the apartheid South Africa was no longer of use to Western powers. And you would have expected something similar to happen with Israel and Palestine, and it hasn't. And I don't know why that is. But it is a kind of weird thing of our age that Israel and Palestine has reaemerged as what seems to be
like not a mystery, Alex.
Well,
it's your globalist outlook of the podcaster from Sao Paulo. I think so. We're not dealing. It's not a ghost of the Cold War that has survived through to the early 21st century. It's very much the product of the end of history. And the same is true of apartheid South Africa, right? Israel-Palestine was resolved. That conflict was resolved through the defeat of the Palestinians and the peace process. So what we're seeing now is the outcome of the peace process, and the fact that the process itself was purely about, it wasn't about resolving anything, it was about a process without a goal. There was the whole point of a peace process is not to actually, it's to keep the process going. It's not actually to resolve the issue, right? And the same is true of Northern Ireland, right? I mean, Northern Ireland has been the troubles, ended with the Good Friday Agreement in 1997. The war ended. But the situation was not resolved, and sure enough, with Brexit secession from the European Union, the status of Northern Ireland, given that it's on the island of Ireland and Ireland is a member of the European Union, has once again been called in, has once again returned and raised the status of Northern Ireland. And similarly with South Africa, right? Apartheid ended, but South Africa remains, if anything, more dysfunctional than it was during the apartheid era. And still kind of endures the terrible racial disparities with the addition of a new kind of black middle class, but also kind of a ferociously punitive state. You just think of the Marikana massacre, right? Black policemen massacring, striking black miners. That was that would have been something like the
Well,
apartheid state would have done.
Yeah.
and the
So
defeat
all
and,
of that,
collapse of the developmental modernizing state, which is also
all of that,
which is also a matter for Israel and Palestine.
all of that, right? It seems to me like is the what's happening in Israel Palestine is consistent with the end of history, as is what's happening with the failure of this, the South African state turning into a failed state, as is consistent with the fact that Northern Ireland has returned to British politics. All of these things seem to me consistent with the broader claim that we make on the pod.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not really a question then of ghosts, but of kind of zombies or Frankenstein's monsters, i.e., something which is not so much a frame that has lost its, I don't know, its references, but something which has gone away and has come back along the lines of a zombie, perhaps. So I just did want to defend your artistic license there, Alex.
No, I think you're right that it is zombie, zombie, not ghost. The matter is that many people will claim around the world that, and will feel that Israel Palestine is the pivotal conflict of the age, or it has become it again, and that it is sucking in major powers on both sides. It has the risk of exploding into a regional war, or indeed, God forbid, something even larger. And I think it's worth considering and asking ourselves the question: how important, how central Israel Palestine is to the structure of world politics, because my default, I've never been terribly interested in Israel and Palestine. I mean, certainly not after university, just simply because it seemed to generate more heat than light. It seemed to be a trapped conflict without any real potential for progressive resolution, and which was and that people's interest in it was completely, was incredibly rancorous, but also disproportional to the actual size of the conflict, the number of people involved, and so on. I didn't see it growing, in the 2000s and the 2010s, as being something which contained in noose all of the world's politics, as many people try to do. That if you unlock Palestine, you unlock somehow the whole world imperialist system, or whatever it might be, right? So it never seemed to me the case, and yet it's kind of reemerged, and we can't deny its centrality insofar as if there's a risk of thus far, for now, it has been a threat which has been kind of delayed and whatever. But Iran's involvement in the conflict and so on, and its sponsors.
Just a point on this, because it really struck me when the Russia-Ukraine war was happening, hearing from two people.
Still is happening, George.
Well, sorry, when it started, when it was happening in the media sense, which it isn't anymore, in the Baudrillardian or whatever sense. Two people, very different ages, who both said that they were worried about nuclear world war, and seriously, quite worried. And it doesn't, I mean, if I'm wrong about this, then we have much bigger problems than me being wrong. But it doesn't seem to be a conflict that could have that sort of, except for through a very, I would say, unlikely chain of events, have that kind of, the structure of the new kind of world Cold War, new kind of World War III nuclear catastrophe. Yeah, so I don't know if it really is, the frame, or the I keep on using that word, the central conflict in the way that some people suggest it is, and that might just be due to my socialization as well. It wasn't, like you were saying, Alex. It wasn't the defining conflict when I was politically socialized. It doesn't, in my mind, capture all the different elements of all the different struggles in world politics. And that, I guess, is almost like it's not like an article of faith. I don't want to put people down who do think that, but it doesn't refract all the other issues in world politics from my view, at least.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm gonna disagree slightly with both of you. So I disagree with Alex and agree with George that I don't think I don't think the significance of the Israel-Palestine conflict is its likelihood of promoting either a wider war or a world war. Now, I accept that a wider regional war is always a risk in a situation like this, and it's more risky now than it was in the past. On the other hand, it's very clear that both Israel and Iran kind of went through this complex choreography of strike and counterstrike as a way of indicating that they were willing to fight, but without willing to really kind of risk embroiling themselves in much more, mutually destructive conflict. So that seems to me that both sides clearly indicated that they clearly indicated to each other and to themselves that they are unwilling, at least at this point, to escalate into a wider regional war. And I think it's very, it's clear that the Iranians would come off much worse than the Israelis in that context as well. So that's one thing. The other thing that where I disagree with George, though, I think it is what makes the Israel-Palestine conflict significant isn't its connection to geopolitical rivalries or to the prospect of a nuclear war, but rather the fact that it's a contest over the primary legitimizing form of politics today, which is over victimhood, as I said at the beginning. And this is what infuses it with such intensity, such bitterness, and why the stakes are so important, both for people who support Israel and for those who support the Palestinians. Is who gets to be the victim, and how can you kind of lay a claim to that authority. And it seems, I think what's happening is that the Palestinians are slowly, or at least rather the elite Westerners are shifting their defense of the victim from the Israeli state to the Palestinians. That's, I think, what we're seeing historically. That, I think, is what's happening. And so we'll be kind of in a situation where we'll still have victimhood politics, but the people who kind of legitimize it at its base will be a different people and in a different context.
I think it might be worth making this explicit, because there's a real difference between saying that a certain conflict, a certain political issue, and its contradictions crystallize the wider politics of the age, in which you say, if you push at this thing, it will blow up everything else, right? It'll open up political avenues, create new possibilities if you get at this one thing. What is claimed about Israel and Palestine, and why people have felt it so important, even prior to October 7th of last year, and the new phase in the conflict, it does not crystallize world politics. It is treated as symbolizing world politics, and it symbolizes it on the terrain of victimhood, as Phil has been rightly saying. And I think that's quite different, because it is symbolic in the way that culture war is symbolic, right? That it solidifies into these sterile oppositions, and where the end goal is the perpetuation of the conflict and the solidification of yourself in your chosen identity. So you are on the side of the good victims against the evil perpetrators, and that doesn't matter whether you're on the Israeli side or on the Palestinian side. The goal of symbolic politics is the perpetuation of that very symbolic politics, which is very different from the claim made about whatever politics it might be, that it crystallizes the general political situation in which pushing at that issue and one side winning sublates the conflict, takes it on to another level, and that there's a genuine kind of revolutionary or progressive moment that comes from the resolution or the kind of transformation of that politics, right? And I think that's very different. And we're unfortunately stuck with Israel and Palestine and a completely symbolic kind of type of politics.
No, I think, but excellent points from both of you about that. It's not at the core; it's the greatest symbol. I think one thing to maybe quite an open question, but we did Civil War, that we talked about the film, and
it's not
there
out
was
yet, but listeners can look forward to that. I think it'll be coming out shortly, a few days after this comes out.
There's a reference in that film to a what seems to have been a campus dispute. So just to kind of go back to, I guess, maybe a little bit the campus protest we started with, like if this is the most symbolic, if the two of you are right, and this is like the symbolic or the overarching like conflict on the status of victimhood, does it have the capacity to become a route to civil war in America? It seems like you could have a kind of, rather than a single consolidated civil war, you could have, a number of discrete civil wars, plural, in each kind of, part of the states. Like each, like I guess it would be the kind of the urban or the university versus the rest of the state. I don't know exactly what I'm kind of gesturing at here, but I guess my question is whether, if the two of you, I think, are correct, as you might well be, that it is so symbolic and so that's why it has the power it does. Is that conflict able to then kind of domesticize itself in different contexts across the world?
By domesticize, you mean become domestic or domesticate,
Yeah.
as in become more contained?
I said I used the word domesticize, which may or may not be actually a word, to become a domestic conflict in the US.
Right.
On the basis of these student protests, we're looking back 5 years hence, and it's like that's how the American Civil War started.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I no.
No, yeah, obviously not.
As you've already made reference to it to Benjamin Studebaker's article called "The Left Can't Gain Anything from This. The Left Cannot Make Use of the Gaza War," which points out, as you've already said, that only 2% of the American population, when polled, of course, opinion polling is bullshit and whatever, but nevertheless, the numbers are significant or significantly divergent enough that it's worth calling out. 35% of people thought the Iraq War was the most important thing when it was happening, and only 2% of Americans think the war in Israel and Palestine is the most important thing. So I think that's significant. I also don't think that it polarizes across society in the same way. But the issue of war, I think, will be increasingly present, unfortunately. And so I wanted maybe to finish off, we can interrogate a claim, again, a point that David Jameson has made in his article and elsewhere. And I think it's made quite clearly, so it's worth using that as a reference point, which is that Israel-Palestine presages sort of a new age of war, that this is a kind of first stage or an indicator of the type of thing that is going to become increasingly common, which makes stopping Israel all the more important. And obviously those are two kind of separate claims. One is a sort of analytical one, and the second one's a political one. I think we can take them a bit separately. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, again, I disagree with. So I think it's accurate that the conflict is, that it presages a new age of war. But you could say the same about the, I mean, that same would be true, say, of the Azerbaijani ethnic cleansing of the Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, right? That you see these kinds of conflicts that are, or, what's happening in kind of Northwest Africa with the emergence of these new African military dictatorships that are siding with Russia over America. So we do see that. I'm not sure that means, though, that restraining Israel becomes the strategic, play of the day in terms of preventing further war breaking out, because it doesn't seem to me to. I don't see how that follows. The claim, it seems to me, there is that if we in the West manage to effectively restrain Israel, then there will be less there'll be less war in the world. Is that, that would seem to be the logic of the claim, that so it's incumbent on, which it seems to me would rather make, seems the what that is saying is that it's effectively boosting the right of the West to restrain war and to contain and limit war around the world, and enhancing the political authority of Western states to intervene on that basis, which they already have and done. Preemptive kind of interventions, military interventions, help to motivate the Iraq War. And it's global policemen, right? It's back to the global kind of trying to retain and project the era of the global policeman of unipolarity further into the 21st century. That seems to me to be the logic of, though, I mean, I'm sure he doesn't intend this, but that seems to me to be the political logic of what Jameson is claiming there. If the idea is we need to just restrain, it's incumbent on us to restrain Israel.
Well, so I don't think that so the era of the global policeman obviously is being eclipsed. I think what has happened in over Ukraine is kind of testament to that. I mean, partly it is, of course, U.S. and NATO overreach and provocation of Russia.
They can't stop
but at the same
Russia,
time, they
and they
couldn't stop
couldn't
Russia
stop
either.
Azerbaijan either. Right?
Exactly. So these, yeah.
So
No,
I mean
but,
that's
yeah,
the
that
point.
is the point I'm making. Yeah, yeah.
If the idea is that through our street protests, if the street protests succeeded in getting Western governments to pull Israel back from the offensive against Gaza, then we will, that will help prevent the new age of war from continuing or breaking out. But that seems to me is the idea that it's effectively boosting the authority of Western states to police the world on by justifying it by the idea of restraining war. Right.
Well,
And that doesn't seem to me to
but
be
this is
in any kind of, that's not kind of meaningful or progressive, because it doesn't seem to me valuable to put ourselves in the position of world policemen, because that is returning to the forever war.
I mean, I understand what you're saying. Isn't, though, the proposal simply that the U.S. stops intervening, right? So it actively supports Israel. If the U.S. just withdrew its support, then that would be achieving at least approximate goal. And that is not making the U.S. a global policeman. It's saying, actually, you can stop Israel by
So the question is, on what grounds do you make to stop U.S. support for Israel? So it seems to me, like there are many good reasons for the US to stop supporting Israel. To stop supporting Israel on the grounds that we need to prevent, it's the way in which we prevent and we exercise restraint on this new age of warfare. The way that Jameson has cast it seems to me to be boosting the authority of the US state rather than restraining it. Quite as opposed to democratizing the foreign policy of the U.S. state, it seems to me it's giving it license to reclaim the mantle of global policeman.
Well, it grounds that authority in a, I guess, a global or like a wider context than the US and the democratic representation there. So I think so that leads you back to the policeman role rather than the kind of the democratic constraint, which is, I think, what I would,
Yeah, I don't think. I happen to think that Israel and Palestine doesn't presage or isn't the example of the future of global warfare. Hopefully, that doesn't materialize. It's more the conflict over Taiwan.
No, but it's an indication of that.
How so?
It's the breakdown. Well, it's it's the transformation from one era into another, and it's unsurprising that we have all these conflicts breaking out in the course of that transition.
I don't know. I'm not sure if Israel and Palestine is the example of that, though. I mean, in Nagorno-Karabakh, absolutely, etc. But I'm not sure if Israel and Palestine, the example that you gestured to, kind of the new race for Africa and increasing assertiveness from certain African powers, particularly in the Sahel, opting for Russia. That I think. Certainly, and this is the shifting of the geopolitical plates. I think we're long overdue an episode on Taiwan, which is coming. But unfortunately, it does seem like increasing friction there isn't going to be abated at any point in the near future. So that's something to be concerned about and to look at.
But it's worth saying, right? So, kind of, how does that play into Israel Palestine? Because if you're, if the idea is that stopping Israel is preventing this new era of war from happening, how does that relate to what the Russians are doing in
Oh yeah,
Ukraine?
I don't think
Or
it
how does
does.
that relate to what? Well, but that's the weakness of the claim. That's what I'm saying, right? So if the idea that only that restraining Israel is preventing kind of the new age of war, that seems to me to be wildly overestimates, to misread the geopolitics of this context, of the conjuncture, and to wildly overestimate Israel's role in it.
Yeah, what does concern me, I think, is the way that increasingly militarized policing and indeed violent action against extermination of surplus populations becomes increasingly a feature of our world. And that's something, a different conversation to the one that we've been having, which relates to geopolitical conflict and war between states or quasi-states. But that is a discussion for another time. Listener, thank you for being with us. As usual, we've covered a lot of ground here. No doubt many people will have opinions on this because people have opinions on this more than they do on any other issue on the face of the planet. And we will, of course, continue discussing it. We'll deal with your questions and comments at the next Alpha Bonus. Tell your friends to come along if you enjoyed this, or if you hated it but you thought it was at least interesting. Then tell your friends to get involved as well. As we say, we're kind of going to abolish those old tiers or phase them out soon. So if you'd like to stick with us, please do so. It's only $2 more a month for getting more than double what you were getting before. So I think that's a good deal. So just quickly, what we've got coming up next, we have Reading Club. If you're a member of that, please join us. It's the Grand Corruption tier. We will be discussing Isaac Deutscher's Landmark. Is it a Landmark book, Phil? Landmark biography of Stalin. Stalinism has a very long tail, and that is one of the issues that I think we'll be dealing with in that Reading Club. We also have our episode discussing Civil War, and that is to say Alex Garland's new film, Civil War, and the politics that ensues from that. We're also doing, I think, another film on Zone of Interest. We're going to be talking about that. So two kind of chunky, crunchy, as Phil likes to say, crunchy political films to discuss. And we have the great Eva Illouz coming on to talk about emotional politics. We've referred to her work so many times across this podcast. It'll be great to finally have her on and to talk to her. We're going to be talking about her most recent book about the affect of populism, but much else besides. So that's to look forward to. We've also got the music journalist Simon Reynolds coming on to talk about more future-oriented music as well as retro stuff, and Sam Chris about a whole range of different issues, including about Saudi modernism and various articles and essays he's had in Damage magazine. Plus, our contributors will be coming on regularly, more from Damage magazine as well, from the past issue and for the current issue. Anyway, plenty to be excited about. I'm excited. I hope you are too. We will see you next week, or indeed in a couple of days, in a matter of a few days. See you very, very soon. Catch you later. Bye-bye.